Sir, I'll need you to move to seat 34E. A family needs to sit together, the flight attendant said, her smile firm. Colonel Jack Brenner looked up from the aisle seat he'd carefully booked months earlier for his injured hip. This seat was chosen for medical reasons, he said calmly. I understand, but we need your cooperation. He didn't argue, just nodded, stood, moved, slowly. No one applauded. No one spoke. Then the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped into the aisle, scanned the cabin, and stopped at the back. Facing the old man, he raised a crisp salute. Colonel Brenner, on behalf of this airline, and as a fellow veteran, we're making this right. The plane hadn't taken off, but honor had just landed. Colonel Jack Brenner, 79, leads a quiet life in the sun-baked hills of Santa Fe, New Mexico. A man whose name commands respect in the local veterans circle, Jack had spent decades serving his country, rising through the ranks with honor. Now as a retiree, he enjoys the solitude of his home, where the echoes of military orders have softened into the gentle rhythms of retirement. He's lived without the constant clamor of battlefield sounds, yet the quiet of his life is not born of loneliness. His wife Sarah had passed many years ago, and though the pain of her absence remains a part of him, Jack had learned to live with it. Still, there is a certain sadness that lingers in his heart, a quiet longing for the days when their conversations filled the room and their laughter painted the air. Now he keeps busy with his community involvement, attending local veterans meetings, helping fellow servicemen and women in any way he can, and maintaining an active role in honoring those who served. Despite his age, Colonel Brenner is far from frail. His body, though no longer capable of the rigorous movements of his youth, is still strong, steeled by years of military training and the experiences that defined his career. But now he's on the move again, driven by a different kind of mission to support his grandson. Jack's family, though, scattered, still holds a special place in his heart, and this trip across the country was one he had been looking forward to for months. His grandson, a talented pianist, had worked tirelessly toward this moment, his final recital at Berklee College of Music in Boston. Jack had promised Sarah before she passed that he would always be there for their family, especially for the young ones who carried on the legacy of their name. Jack's journey begins, as most journeys do for men of his generation, methodical, precise, and full of preparation. He had carefully chosen his flight seat months ago, meticulously selecting 17D, an aisle seat in the extended comfort section. This seat wasn't chosen for the luxury it provided, but for the space it afforded his aging body. Years earlier, during a training exercise involving parachute jumps, Jack had suffered a severe injury to his hip. While he never spoke much about the accident, its effects were still evident every day, particularly when he had to sit for extended periods. His body, once lean and agile, had become an intricate collection of scars and well-earned aches. The seat he had chosen would give him the legroom he needed to manage his injury. For Jack, this wasn't just a flight. It was a moment of honor, a gesture of self-care, a soldier's final act of respecting his own limitations. As Jack sat in his seat, waiting for the flight to take off, he looked out the window, observing the vast expanse of the land below. He thought of his military days, the discipline, the comrades who had become brothers. He thought of Sarah, his late wife, and how she would have loved to see their grandson achieve this milestone. The warmth of that memory filled him with a quiet joy as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. Yet despite all of the pride he felt in his family and the sacrifices he had made there, was still a part of him that felt invisible. His body was aging, his movements slower, and his life, while rich in history, was one that was slipping further into the background. Still, Jack Brenner was a man who had never asked for recognition, and he certainly wasn't expecting any now, as he settled into the familiar, comforting rhythm of his flight, ready to support his family in the quietest, most steadfast way he knew how. But little did Jack know this was about to change. The events of this flight would become something far greater than he had ever anticipated, an act of recognition, an unexpected honor that would remind him that even in his golden years, his service and his story had not been forgotten. The boarding process was nearly complete. Overhead bins thudded shut, babies fussed in the background, and the cabin buzzed with the low murmur of travel. Colonel Jack Brenner had settled comfortably into seat 17D, his legs stretched carefully into the small corridor of extra space he'd secured months ago. The aisle seat allowed him to stand and stretch when needed, something his hip, scarred from a training jump decades ago, demanded more than he liked to admit. Jack wasn't a man who asked for much. He moved slowly but deliberately with the bearing of someone who once commanded others by simply walking into a room. His hands rested calmly on his lap as he waited for the final boarding announcements. Then came the voice. "Excuse me, sir," a flight attendant said gently. "Are you Mr. Brenner?" Jack turned to see her, a woman in her late 30s with her hair tied back in a tidy bun and a crisp red scarf looped around her neck. Her badge read, Melanie. She wore the polished expression of someone who'd practiced it thousands of times. "Yes, I am," Jack replied, adjusting slightly in his seat. "Mr. Brenner," she began again, maintaining her bright but professional tone. "I hate to ask this, but we have a family, a mother with two small children who were separated during booking. Your row is the only one in this section that can accommodate all three of them sitting together." Jack blinked, the request catching him off guard. "You'd like me to move?" Melanie nodded, her smile unwavering. "Yes, sir. If it's not too much trouble, it would really help." Jack sat straighter. "I booked this seat specifically. I've got a bad hip from an old jump injury. That's why I chose the aisle, and this row extra space helps me walk without locking up." There was no anger in his voice, only quiet explanation, clarity, facts. Melanie's smile didn't falter, but her posture shifted ever so slightly. She glanced down at her tablet, then looked back at Jack. "I understand, sir, and I truly appreciate your service. But we do need to prioritize families, especially those with small children. It's airline policy." The words were spoken kindly, but the shift was clear. This wasn't really a request anymore. Jack paused. "Is there another aisle seat in this section?" She shook her head. "Unfortunately, all the other aisle seats in extended comfort are taken, and first class is full." "Where would you move me?" "Seat 34E, she replied. He raised an eyebrow. "That's a middle seat." She offered a slightly apologetic nod toward the back. "But we'd be happy to offer you a complimentary snack and beverage for your trouble. A soda and a bag of pretzels." That was the price of giving up a seat he'd booked with purpose, one he needed not out of entitlement, but out of pain. Jack looked up at her, his face calm but steady. "This isn't about comfort, young lady. It's about medical necessity." "I know, Sir," Melanie said quickly. "But the flight can't depart until this family is seated together. We're asking for your cooperation." Passengers in nearby rows had gone quiet, listening without looking. Jack could feel the pressure pressing in, unspoken but real, a quiet nudge cloaked in procedure. He sighed slowly and glanced at the family a few rows back. The mother stood awkwardly, two little hands gripping her coat. With effort, he reached for the armrest, bracing to stand. "I'll move," he said softly. "But I want it noted I gave up a medically necessary seat. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to be the one blamed for a delay." Melanie offered a polite, relieved thank you. But to Jack, it didn't feel like gratitude. It felt like being dismissed. Again. Colonel Jack Brenner stood slowly, placing one hand firmly on the armrest and the other on the back of the seat in front of him. His movements were careful, deliberate, like a man who had learned long ago not to show discomfort if it could be helped. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was an airplane. And even here, the instincts of dignity and quiet endurance remained. The aisle was narrow. His hip, already beginning to tighten, protested as he turned to retrieve his carry-on from the overhead bin. Melanie, the flight attendant, offered to assist, but he politely declined. If he could still carry his own gear, he would. He always did. Passengers pretended not to watch, but he felt their eyes. A few looked away quickly when he caught their gaze, ashamed or indifferent, he couldn't tell which. The mother with the children offered a weak, embarrassed smile as he passed. Jack nodded once, out of habit more than sentiment. None of this was her fault, but that didn't make it right. Seat 34E was exactly what he had expected. A tight, narrow space wedged between a man who was already spread comfortably across the shared armrest and a young woman with headphones buried in her phone. Neither acknowledged him. He stowed his small bag and eased into the middle seat, carefully lowering himself until he settled into place with a quiet grimace. There was no room to stretch, no place to shift. The armrest pinned him in. His left hip, already inflamed by the act of standing and walking, began to throb almost immediately. Within minutes, a dull, heavy ache radiated down his lower back and into his thigh. It was the kind of pain he had grown familiar with over the years, one that crept in slowly like a tide, until it consumed every thought and made even breathing feel like labor. Jack clenched his jaw but said nothing. He'd sat through worse. He'd endured longer nights on colder ground in places far more hostile than this. But there was something different about this pain. It wasn't just physical. It was the sting of knowing he'd been moved not for safety, not for emergency, but because he was easier to ask than someone else. Because to the airline, a quiet old veteran with a limp was a softer target than an irate mother or a screaming child. And that hurt in a way no injury ever had. He shifted slightly, trying to relieve the pressure on his hip, but the seat offered no grace. The man beside him continued to hog the armrest, unaware or unwilling to share space. The young woman scrolled through videos, oblivious to the veteran in pain beside her. No one knew what seat 17D had meant. No one cared that he had paid extra from a modest pension for that single aisle seat that allowed him to stand and stretch and breathe. Now he was just another body in the back of the plane, folded into a seat not made for men like him, forgotten before the flight had even taken off. He exhaled slowly, letting the discomfort settle deep into his bones. He had given up the space he needed, not for gratitude or recognition, but to avoid a scene, to spare someone else the trouble, to keep the peace. That was the sacrifice. Quiet, invisible, expected. 3 rows ahead of where Colonel Jack Brenner had just been forced to surrender his seat, a young man in his early 30s sat in seat 16R, quietly watching the entire scene unfold. His name was Ryan Ellison, sharp suit, discreet designer watch, and the calm, analytical gaze of someone who had spent years learning how to read rooms and measure silence. He wasn't the type to speak up impulsively, but what he had just witnessed sat uncomfortably with him. Ryan was a senior VP of strategy at one of Silicon Valley's fastest-growing tech firms. His loyalty to any airline was purely data-driven, whoever offered speed, reliability, and top-tier perks. But today what he saw wasn't about service tiers or upgraded cabins. It was about something that algorithms couldn't quantify: human decency. He had boarded just ahead of Colonel Brenner. Ryan had noticed the man's limp, the careful way he navigated the aisle. He had seen the way Jack shifted slowly into the seat he'd clearly chosen with purpose. That kind of movement didn't come from age alone. It came from living through something and surviving it. When the flight attendant had leaned in with her forced smile and corporate script, Ryan's gut clenched. He heard every word, and though the volume was soft, the message was clear: convenience over care. He watched Jack try to explain his injury, his quiet composure, his rational questions, and the way it was all waved aside. A medically necessary seat given up for policy. Ryan didn't know the man's full story, but he knew enough. Knew what the ribbons on the old man's duffel meant. Knew that service like his didn't ask for special treatment, but deserved respect. He pulled out his phone and opened a secure app used by Skybound Air's elite concierge members, a direct line to the airline's top-level customer service and operations team. Normally, it was for things like rebooking on short notice or handling baggage mishaps. Today, it would serve another purpose. He began typing passenger in 17D, now 34E, Colonel Jack Brenner, U.S. Army, retired, 79 years old. Mobility issues due to service-connected hip injury. Was forced to surrender medically necessary aisle seat in extended comfort after being asked by F.A. Melanie to accommodate family of 3. Offered only snack voucher. Clearly invisible discomfort now. This is unacceptable. He hit send. Then after a moment's pause, he typed again. I'm seated in 16A. I witnessed entire interaction. Request immediate review. Recommend notifying captain before departure. Passenger is a decorated veteran who deserves better. The message pinged, delivered. Ryan knew that someone on the other end, possibly someone sitting in an airport command center, would read that within seconds. Maybe they'd ignore it. Maybe they'd pass it along. Or maybe, just maybe, someone would care enough to act. He looked back toward the rear of the plane. Jack was seated rigidly between 2 passengers, his body tense, his jaw clenched. There was no dramatic protest, no scene. Just quiet suffering. Ryan wasn't one for grand gestures. But this wasn't about heroics. This was about decency. And sometimes decency starts with a simple decision. Say something when others don't, because someone needs to. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft continued its slow crawl across the tarmac. Safety instructions played on the monitors. Seatbelts clicked into place. Passengers settled in for what they expected would be an uneventful 5-hour flight to Boston. But something unusual was about to happen. It began with a quiet chime, one of those muted tones only crew members typically register. Then, without warning, the cockpit door unlatched and eased open. Heads turned. Even the most seasoned travelers looked up. It was a rare sight. Once the doors closed for taxi, they almost never reopened until landing. Whatever this was, it wasn't routine. Captain Alex Worth stepped into the aisle. He stood tall, built like a man who had once worn a different kind of uniform. Late 50s silver at his temples, eyes like polished steel. His presence demanded attention, not by force, but by quiet authority. His navy blue pilot's uniform was crisp, the 4 gold stripes on his shoulders shining in the overhead lights. He didn't speak, didn't rush, just scanned the cabin slowly, row by row. Passengers watched in silence, unsure what to expect. Was there a problem, a medical emergency, a security issue? But the captain wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for someone. And then he saw him. Row 34, middle seat, shoulders squared, hands folded tightly on his lap. A man sitting in silent discomfort. Colonel Jack Brenner. The captain's expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Maybe both. Without saying a word, Captain Worth made his way down the aisle toward the rear of the plane. Each step deliberate, eyes forward. It was not showmanship, it was purpose. When he reached Jack's row, he stopped. The passengers nearby went still. Even the woman beside Jack lowered her phone. Captain Worth didn't ask questions, didn't request confirmation. He already knew. He stood tall, adjusted his posture, then brought his right hand up to his brow in a sharp, perfect salute, the kind only those with service in their bones know how to give. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Jack Brenner, the captain, said, his voice calm and steady. "Sir, I was just informed of what happened, and as a fellow veteran and as captain of this flight, I'm here to tell you that this airline got it wrong." Jack blinked, stunned. For a moment, he didn't respond. "I'm not here to apologize with a voucher," Captain Worth continued. "I'm here to offer you back the dignity that should have never been taken." There was no announcement, no fanfare, but somehow the entire cabin seemed to understand what they were witnessing. A correction in motion, a man being seen. Jack slowly lifted his eyes, meeting the captain's gaze. The old colonel didn't speak. He simply returned the salute slower, but just as crisp. 2 men, 2 generations. 1 uniform. The plane hadn't taken off yet, but in that moment something far more important had already taken flight on her. Captain Alex Worth remained standing in the narrow aisle, his gaze still locked with Colonel Jack Brenner's. The silence that followed his salute stretched across the cabin, reverent and heavy, as though the aircraft itself had paused to listen. Then the captain turned to face the passengers, raising his voice just enough to carry across the economy section without needing the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this man seated here is Colonel Jack Brenner. He served our country with honor. He's carried burdens that most of us will never understand. And today on this very flight, we failed him." No one moved. Some passengers sat frozen mid-sip of their drinks. Others had their phones lowered in their laps. The weight of the moment pressed gently on every shoulder. Captain Worth continued, voice steady but firm. He booked an aisle seat with extra legroom because of a service-connected injury. He explained his medical need, and instead of being honored or even simply accommodated, he was moved from his carefully chosen seat to a cramped middle one at the back of the plane. He paused to let that sink in. This wasn't just a mistake, the captain said. It was a lapse in judgment, a moment where policy was followed but decency was forgotten. Then his tone shifted, not unkind but commanding. "Flight attendant Melanie," he said, turning slightly. Melanie, who had been lingering halfway up the cabin near the galley, stiffened at the sound of her name. Passengers glanced her way. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a pale, strained expression. "Yes, Captain," she said quietly. "You will personally escort Colonel Brenner to seat 1C in first class," he instructed. "Immediately." Melanie hesitated. "But Sir, 1C is currently, if there is someone seated there, you will ask for a volunteer. And if no one volunteers, the captain said you will explain that the captain of this aircraft is reallocating that seat to a man who's already paid far more than any of us ever will." Melanie nodded mutely. Captain Worth looked back at Jack. "Colonel, please gather your things. Let us restore what should never have been taken. As Jack slowly rose from his seat, his hip protesting with every movement, passengers along the row leaned back to give him space. The man beside him slid his legs aside. Even the young woman with the headphones lowered them, eyes wide with realization. As Jack stepped into the aisle, Melanie moved toward him, her posture no longer officious but respectful. Somewhere mid-cabin, a man clapped once, then another. It wasn't a standing ovation, it wasn't a performance. It was quieter, a ripple of acknowledgement, of recognition. As Jack walked past the rows he'd once been asked to surrender, a hush followed him. Not the kind born of fear or awkwardness, but of reverence. Because today, 30,000 feet below their final destination, these passengers had witnessed something rare. Not just policy corrected, but respect restored. When Flight 726 finally touched down in Boston, the landing was smooth, but the weight in the cabin was something that couldn't be measured in turbulence. Passengers disembarked in quiet waves, many casting brief, thoughtful glances toward the first-class cabin, where Colonel Jack Brenner now sat. His face was calm, unreadable, but his posture had shifted, no longer curled inward in discomfort, but upright, steady, as if he'd just marched across the years and reclaimed something that had once been quietly taken. As Jack stepped off the plane, he was met at the gate by a representative from Skybound Air's senior leadership. Not a gate agent, not a customer service trainee, but someone wearing a blazer with a gold badge and a nameplate that read, Elizabeth H. VP of Guest Experience. Colonel Brenner, she said, extending her hand with sincerity on behalf of Skybound Air, please accept my deepest apology. What happened on that flight should never have occurred, and I assure you we're taking it seriously. Jack simply nodded. He wasn't the type to chase apologies, but he could tell this one wasn't scripted. It came from somewhere real. Elizabeth handed him a small envelope. Inside was a full refund of his original ticket and a voucher for future first-class travel for 2 valid anytime, anywhere, with no blackout dates. We'd be honored to have you and any member of your family fly with us again, she said, as our guests. Jack accepted it, saying little. His quiet strength did the speaking for him. But behind the scenes, Skybound Air moved quickly. Within 48 hours, the flight incident was flagged for executive review. The internal report included not only the customer complaint sent by Ryan Ellison, the tech executive in row 16, but also the captain's formal account and feedback from several passengers who had witnessed the moment. The company issued a statement internally and later publicly reaffirming its commitment to honoring veterans and service members. A comprehensive review of veteran seating accommodations was launched. Staff retraining programs were expedited with a specific focus on handling passengers with visible and invisible injuries. The lesson was clear honor isn't just found in ceremony, it lives in the choices made quietly in the aisles of crowded planes, in the dignity of everyday decisions. For Jack, the recognition didn't erase the pain, but it reminded him that sometimes even systems can remember what humans forget. And sometimes all it takes is one moment, one voice, and one act of respect to set it right. 2 days after the flight, Colonel Jack Brenner sat in the grand concert hall at Berklee College of Music. The lights were dim, the piano on stage polished to a soft gleam, and the audience hushed in anticipation. Jack sat in the second row, close enough to see every key, every movement, his back straight, shoulders squared, and for the first time in years without the telltale stiffness of pain. The airline's first-class seat had made a difference, yes. But more than that, it was the feeling that he had been seen. That his service, his sacrifices hadn't been quietly erased for convenience. The limp for once didn't lead the way. His presence did. When his grandson Nathan stepped on stage and sat before the piano, he paused before playing. The spotlight caught the slight smile on his face as he adjusted the bench and looked out over the audience. This last piece, he said into the mic, is dedicated to someone who taught me what strength really means. Not just with words, but with quiet actions. My hero, Grandpa Jack. A soft murmur moved through the room. Jack didn't move, but his eyes glistened. He hadn't come looking for honor, but it had found him anyway, from a captain in the sky and from a boy on a stage. As Nathan played, Jack's mind drifted not far, but just enough to remember. He remembered the discomfort, the silence, the tight seat at the back of the plane. And then he remembered the sound of boots walking down the aisle, the crisp salute, the words spoken not from a manual, but from one veteran to another. One man had made a mistake. Another had made it right. And that, Jack thought, was the difference. Not every system gets it right. Policies can fall short, but character, that still matters. At 30,000 feet, it wasn't a refund or a free meal that restored his dignity. It was a captain who stepped out of the cockpit and into a moment of truth. That's what respect looks like. Not in grand speeches, but in who stands up and when. In today's fast-moving world where convenience often trumps compassion, this story reminds us of something deeply American. Something timeless. Respect is not about policy, it's about people. Colonel Jack Brenner didn't ask to be honored. He didn't demand applause or special treatment. He simply asked for dignity and was nearly denied it. But one man, Captain Worth, stood up when it mattered. He reminded everyone on board that character is still the most powerful rank of all. This story isn't just about a seat on a plane. It's about how we treat the people who came before us, those who carried burdens in silence, who built the foundations we now walk on. Whether it's a veteran in row 34 or a neighbor down the street, the lesson is the same: respect must live in action, not just words. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever seen a quiet act of courage or kindness that changed everything? Do you think companies today still honor service and sacrifice the way they should? And what would you have done if you were on that flight? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else. If this message touched your heart, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with someone who still believes in doing what's right even when no one's looking. Thank you for watching, for remembering, and for standing with us to honor those who've served not just with words, but with understanding, respect, and humanity. Because sometimes the smallest gesture becomes the loudest salute.